Hello everyone, Hyper here. As promised, we are far enough into the new patch and we have enough data through logs to clear up some of the uncertainties from my basic guide. In this video, I will go into more detail about stats, breakpoints, rotation, micromanaging buffs, debuffs, the new set bonus, legendaries, and some specific Tomb of Sargeras tips. Also, I've seen a lot of questions about what build to run for different affixes in Mythic Plus, which I will also briefly talk about in this guide. I was going to wait to record this video until I got my shoulder legendary and 4-piece tier 20, but I've gotten 2 legendaries since the patch and neither were the shoulders, so I'm not going to put this off any longer. There are a lot of great resources like Sims 2 Relics and Trinkets, which I will briefly show in this guide, and I will have the link to them in the description box. As always, the timestamps to the major topics will be under the video. Let's get started. First of all, I wanted to show you guys where you can find very specific information about Unholy DK. Huge thanks to the people who work on these and make sure they stay up to date. The most common place to find help is the Accurus Discord, where they will have a lot of info pinned, but as always, feel free to ask me and I will try to help you out. There's a great spreadsheet that is updated for this patch, which includes Trinkets and Relic Sims for both Frost and Unholy. Always remember that these are based on a template and it might be slightly different for your character, so if in doubt, just sim it. The first major topic I will talk about is the current legendary priority. I will have the legendaries broken down into a few tiers, and I will only talk about the unholy legendaries, since the ones for the other specs just come down to what stats they have on them. For single target, in the S tier, we have Cold Heart, the new chest, and the Tic Tac shoulders, whose name I can't pronounce. Both of these are huge DPS upgrades when it comes to single target. The Chains of Ice from the chest does scale with mastery and attack power, and it is also buffed by our 2-piece set bonus. This means that in the most ideal situation, you will have the tier bonus procced, Unholy Strength, Concordance, and your neck enchant active, as well as any trinkets that procced mastery or strength. Obviously this rarely happens, but at 20 stacks with this legendary, you will get some massive crits in. The shoulders also bring an interesting dynamic, because they buff your Dark Arbiter, as well as your Apocalypse and Army of the Dead ghouls. With Dark Arbiter being one of our top damaging spells single target, it's a really nice DPS increase, especially when paired with Shadow Infusion. So what I'm about to say only applies if you have the legendary shoulders. For pure single target, you should use Shadow Infusion, because it will line up nicely with a few timings. After your opener, which I will go into later, you will use Dark Transformation after summoning Dark Arbiter. Then the second Dark Transformation you will cast as soon as it's back up. And from there, you will have to hold your third DT for when your Arbiter Apocalypse combo. The way the timings work out, every odd numbered DT you will pair with Dark Arbiter, while every even numbered you will just cast as soon as possible. If you have the 4-piece set bonus, your Army of the Dead will also come off cooldown around the time of your 4th Dark Transformation, so you might want to combo those as well. In Tier 1, we have Soul of the Deathlord, the new ring, Kil'jaeden's Burning Wish, the trinket, and the Instructor's 4th lesson, the bracers. The trinket is very good because of the raw stats it provides, because let's be honest, the active is basically negligible single target. The new ring allows us to take Bursting Swords as well as Ebon Fever, both of which are an increase in DPS both single target and AoE situations. The bracers have been nerfed twice, but they're still a decent damage increase. In Tier 2, we have Uvenimor, the ring, Draugr, the belt, and Deathmarch, the helm. The ring and the belt have fallen off a lot since the patch, so I would only use them if I don't have any legendaries in the tier above. However, Deathmarch is an extremely good legendary for AoE situations. If paired with the trinket or the new ring, along with the Defile build, it is extremely powerful. In Tier 3, we basically have the rest of the legendaries, which only provide utility, and the DPS increase they provide all come down to the stats they have, so try equipping ones with mastery on them. Next, let's talk about talent choices, specifically for Tomb of Sargeras. The default build that I showed in my last video is still viable. However, depending on the legendaries you have, you might be able to change a few things for a slight damage increase. If you have the shoulder legendary, you should always run Shadow Infusion single target, or Infected Claws if your raid is in need for more cleave damage. Without the shoulders, I would recommend using Infected Claws in all situations. There are 2 basic builds which I recommend following in Tomb. First is the traditional Dark Arbiter build, for which I mentioned the variants depending on your legendaries. For AoE fights such as Harjatan and Mistress, you can choose to go a full AoE build, which is Ebon Fever, Pestilent Postules, Clawing Shadows, Infected Claws, and Defile. Only go this build if you're trying to pad on the adds and your raid is in need of extra AoE damage. I personally stick to my single target build on all fights, because our raid has classes who are better equipped to deal with adds than I am. This means that I still do everything I can, like spreading Virulent Plague and cleaving them with Death and Decay, but I barely sacrifice single target damage for a significant increase in overall damage. When it comes to Mythic Plus, I get this question a lot. What build do you run for X affixes? Well, the general rule that I follow is, if the third affix is tyrannical, then I go with the Dark Arbiter build for any key that's over a 13, and with the Defile build for anything below that. This also depends on the type of damage you have in your group. If you have two other DPS that are almost pure single target, then you might want to go a Defile build no matter what. On the other hand, if your group has really good AoE damage, then you can run a more single target build. On Fortified affix, I always run a Defile build because bosses are extremely easy. I never pay attention to the two minor affixes when it comes to choosing my talents, but it is worth noting that explosive orbs can't be hit by Clawing Shadows. Hopefully this will be fixed soon. A few tips for Mythic Plus: you should have 2 gear sets saved if you're doing high level keys. One set should have AoE legendaries such as the Ring, Helm, Bracers, or Trinket to make trash easier, and a single target set which you can swap into before bosses. Another little trick is casting Army of the Dead about 2 seconds before the key is activated. This way you will keep 3 ghouls and the buff from the set bonus. I briefly mentioned relics in my basic guide, but I think it's worth going into more detail and break down the relic priorities, as well as how big of an upgrade each might be. Our best relic currently is the one with the Plague Bearer trait, but since Entomb only Kill Jaden drops a shadow one with this trait, most people will most likely have to settle for the Darkest Crusade relics, which are most abundant in both Mythic Plus and raids. Since Darkest Crusade relics are so common, I don't really see a reason to go for Deadliest Coil relics, because they only offer single target increase in damage. Just to recap, ideally you will want triple Plague Bearer relics. The Shadow one drops from Kill Jaden or Gul'dan, so that might be decently easy to get. However, getting a Fire and Blood relic with this trait is a lot trickier, since you would need to do Mythic Crosis hoping for a Titan Forge or spam COEN or Karazhan, neither of which are too much fun in my opinion. The spreadsheet in the description does have a full breakdown of all relics up to Titan Forge cap, so if you're not sure, then use that as a general rule. Now let's talk about the biggest point of conversation in this video, stats. As in our Unholy DK, there are a few haste breakpoints which are nice to reach. The 2 haste breakpoints are for global cooldowns and extra attacks on Dark Arbiter. Calculating exact breakpoints for Dark Arbiter is a little tricky since her active casting time varies. It does seem like they made some undocumented changes to her, which means her summoning animation is more consistent, and they also reduced her haste scaling. But there is still a slight variation, meaning that sometimes you will get plus or minus 1 attack with her at the exact same haste if you're in between breakpoints. There are 2 major haste points that are worth going for depending on how your gear is statted. The first is at 16%. Here you will always get 10 casts from your Dark Arbiter. The next one is at 24%, which is where you will consistently get 11 casts. These are both without Hero or Lust, which will give you 3 extra casts on your Dark Arbiter. If you're in between these 2 values, you might notice that sometimes you get 10 and other times you might get 11, depending on which breakpoint you're closer to. This is all due to the Dark Arbiter's intro animation, which can vary by a fraction of a second, causing her to miss an attack or cast an extra one. Take these values with a grain of salt, because until the cast animation is 100% consistent, these values are slightly higher than what you actually need, just to make sure you will consistently get the extra cast. With all this haste soft cap and breakpoints out of the way, the general stat priority still remains. Mastery is our best secondary stat. This means it's only worth enchanting or gemming for haste if you're trying to reach a specific breakpoint and you're slightly short on stats. Even after breakpoints, haste is our second best stat, since it does affect our rune regeneration as well. After haste, crit and versatility are very close to each other, and it just comes down to how much of each you have, to which one is better. Next, let's talk a little bit about our new tier and how it affects our rotation and gameplay. There are a few things to keep in mind with the 2-piece set bonus. It only buffs your damage by 15%, meaning that your pet and Dark Arbiter or Gargoyle does not benefit from it. However, lining up the 42 seconds of buff from the Army and Apocalypse with a potion is a pretty nice damage boost. This is also where the 4-piece set bonus comes into play. Lining up your second potion with second Army and Apocalypse will allow you to have the 15% damage buff for the majority of it. And this will also have your Dark Arbiter in this window to benefit from the potion if you're using Convergence of Fates. If not, then you can delay the cast of Army, because on most bosses you will only get to use it twice. Of course, some of the later bosses that are extremely long, you might get 3 or more casts. So it might be a good idea to hold it off depending on the boss length. Back to items we should be looking at getting. There are a few good trinkets that are pretty close together in power. On Sims, Spectre of Betrayal is a little overvalued because they assume that the boss never moves, so you get the full benefit from both ghosts when you cast it. This would only happen on bosses like Star Augur, where the boss actually can't be moved. Even though Sims slightly overvalue it, it still looks like our best trinket out of TOS. All 4 melee trinkets from the raid are useful in different situations, which I will talk about here. Vial of Ceaseless Toxins is nice if you can benefit from the resets, especially because there are so many ad fights in the raid. You can get the cooldown resets on it by using it on the ads instead of the boss. This trinket also scales with our mastery, which makes it much better for us than any other classes. Cradle of Anguish can be a nice parsing trinket for bosses that your raid is extremely comfortable with, and you are more often than not over the 80% health mark. Engine of Eradication has an interesting design. It works a lot like Demon Hunter orbs. Whenever the trinket procs, a few orbs spawn, and picking them up extends the duration of the buff. If you can stay within melee range while picking them up, then you should always pick them up. But if you lose some downtime, you can ignore 1 or 2. The last trinket I wanted to talk about is Convergence of Fates out of the Nighthold. Now this trinket is still really good, even at lower item levels, just because its proc actually doesn't scale with item level. So even if you have a 900 or even below that, it might still outbeat like 910 or 915 trinkets out of Tomb of Sargeras. However, its value scales with how long the fight is. So if you have a very short fight and you don't benefit from it because you don't get an extra cast of Dark Arbiter, then it's basically just a strength stat stick with nothing else on it. So its value is very low. However, if it's a very long boss fight and you get 2 or 3 extra Dark Arbiter casts out of it, then it increases in value a lot compared to other trinkets. So again, this trinket you just kind of have to judge how long the fight is going to be if you have another trinket that you would like to use. Next, a few TOS boss tips. Most of these will have to do with Anti-Magic Shell and what mechanics can be mitigated by it. On Goroth, if you're targeted by the meteor, using AMS right before the hit will prevent the dot from being applied, which is really nice on Mythic. On Demonic Inquisition, you can AMS if you're affected by the dot, which needs to be dispelled, to avoid gaining Torment. On Harjatan, make sure you have a few wounds stacked up on the boss and have Death and Decay ready to go when he casts Commanding Shout. On Mistress Sassin, save DND for the eels. AMS will only help with the Ink Pool dot or the acid from Hydra Shot. On Fallen Avatar, your AMS will be up every time he casts Rupturing Realities, so you don't have to run too far out. Kil'jaeden is really nice as an Unholy DK because you can AMS the Armageddon dot, so you can help soak every round if needed. I can't give too many DPS tricks for these bosses since a lot of it does come down to your raid's timing, but if you know any specific ones, just leave them in the comments. I wanted to briefly talk about the opener because I see this question a lot on forums and on Discord. With the 2-piece set bonus, do you cast army on 6 or on 0? Well, it actually is a little more complicated than that, and it doesn't matter as much as you might think. From looking at the top logs, there are 3 different openers that I see. These openers will assume that you have the chest and shoulder legendaries. First one is army on 6, that way you will have your runes back up when the fight starts, but this means that you miss out on 6 seconds of the buff. After that, the opener's default: Outbreak on pull, Festering Strike 2 or 3 times, Chains of Ice, Apocalypse, Arbiter, and then Dark Transformation. Then you just go into your normal priority. The second opener which I've seen is Army on pull, then Outbreak, Chains of Ice, and wait for your runes to regen, after which you continue just like the previous one. The third variation is Outbreak on pull, Festering Strike twice, then Chains of Ice, Apocalypse, and then cast Army of the Dead and pop Dark Arbiter. With this opener, you benefit from the entire duration of the 2-piece buff. So which opener should you use? In my opinion, it comes down to preference. All three of these are pulled from top 10 logs, so obviously the first few seconds of a fight don't make or break your damage. Using any of the threes is a good option, since most of the damage comes down to how you deal with the rest of the fight. I tend to either use the one where I cast it on 6 seconds, or the one where I do a few spells and then cast it right before Arbiter, because that way I don't have too much downtime and I can spend my runic power while my runes are regenerating. As Unholy, there are a lot of debuffs and buffs which can be micromanaged in order to gain more damage. First one, and most important of them all, Scourge of Worlds. Whenever this debuff pops up on your target, you will want to cast as many Scourge Strikes as you can. The way I deal with this debuff is try not to cast Death Coil when I have less than 4 wounds on the target, unless I'm RP capped. Next is Virulent Plague. Try aiming for near 100% uptime. This means refreshing the debuff before its last tick. The only time I don't do this is when ads are about to spawn, and I slightly delay outbreaking in order to spread Virulent Plague to them. I personally don't micromanage Runic Corruption unless I'm getting very lucky with Scourge of World procs. The ideal gameplay with Runic Corruption would be not casting Death Coil when it's already active, but that would mean we would stay RP capped for quite a while, which is just not worth it. As for Concordance and Unholy Strength, I keep my eye on them for Apocalypse and Cold Heart. That way, I get a damage boost whenever they're up. If neither of them proc within 5 seconds of my Cold Heart stacking to full or APOC coming off cooldown, I just cast them anyway. The last thing I will mention is our pets. Death Coil refunds 10 energy to our Abomination, so casting it when he's already at full is a slight waste. I don't think it's worth keeping an eye on just because of how many things we already have to pay attention to. But if you're really good at keeping track of a lot of things at the same time, this will also help your DPS slightly. The last thing you should keep an eye on is your 2-piece set bonus, mainly when comboing it with Chains of Ice from Cold Heart. When casting this at 20 stacks, you should always have your 2-piece set bonus up, because the 15% damage increase is huge on a massive crit like that. As for macros, I only use 4 macros as Unholy. First is a mouseover outbreak macro, making it easier to dot up multiple targets when they are spread. The second is a mouseover death grip macro. And the last two are my mouseover hook and stun macros. These are definitely not necessary, but they will make life slightly easier when having to grip ads onto the boss. I will have a focus macro for all these abilities and my kick, but having a focus kick is only necessary if you're in interrupt rotation and you have to target something else at the same time. I will have a template to these in the description box, and you can just edit the spell that you would like to make it into a mouseover. As always, if you have any questions or think I left something out worth talking about, just leave it in the comments section and I will get back to you. If you like my UI or want to import any of my weak auras, check out my full UI video. The weak auras have been updated on my WoW page to what you see in this video. I want to use this video as a resource for Unholy DKs. So if you have any tips or tricks or little things about stats or rotation that most people don't know about, just leave it in the comments section. I love to talk about these kinds of things, and also sharing it with others will help a lot of people. Thank you all for watching, and if you'd like to see more content, please hit the subscribe button. Goodbye.